In the 1980s and 1990s, the Hawke and Keating governments took away protections for some key industries against foreign competition. The protection had mostly been in the form of tariffs, extra taxes on imported goods to increase their price. It was part of a global push to free up trade around the world. But times have changed. Today, the way governments think about their industrial sectors and industry policy is different. It's not so much about protecting industries and their workforces as trying to help push and pull economies into the net zero world. And in the wake of supply chain issues exposed by a global pandemic, it is also about assessing what industries we need to have onshore so that we are not vulnerable to a sudden cut-off in supplies.
If we don't act to shape the future will shape us. We need to be willing to break with old orthodoxies and pull new levers to advance the national interest.
In April this year, the Prime Minister unveiled the proposed Future Made in Australia legislation to govern this new approach, citing changes initiated by governments from the United States and the European Union to Japan, Korea and Canada.
All these countries are investing in their industrial base, their manufacturing capability and their economic sovereignty. This is not old-fashioned protectionism or isolationism. It is the new competition.
The plan in Australia is to establish a national interest framework against which government assistance is assessed, rather than assistance being given out as one-offs, possibly involving pork barrelling or special treatment driven by political pressures. The framework seeks to ask two basic questions. Will assistance help our transition to a net zero economy or improve the economy's resilience to supply chain shock?
Any sensible economist would always say if you're going to do industry policy, the way you do it's really important, because we know from history that these things can fall into pretty well-known traps of policy. We don't want governments picking winners, and we certainly don't want losers picking governments.
The legislation passed the House of Representatives last month and is currently subject to a Senate inquiry due to report this week. Parliamentarians, policy analysts and business groups have questions about the legislation, even if they support its overall aim.
I think we need stronger guardrails around the Future Made in Australia. We should only be supporting sectors where the Treasury and others such as the Productivity Commission say, yep, this is a sector we can back.
I think that's where we would be concerned about the current bill, that it doesn't really provide those guardrails to ensure that we don't have what other people have said is pork barrelling.
Submissions to the Senate inquiry are mostly supportive of the national interest framework idea, but the criticisms of the actual legislation are that the national interest definition is too vague and that the process of determining which sectors the government should invest in are also too vague.
Look, I think the top level thing and the most critical thing in our view is having established this concept of the national interest framework, it should be very clear as to how that assessment process will be applied to the decision-making process. That's where the big gap is, and if we get that right, we've got some chance of making some real progress.
There are two proposed streams of funding, one offering assistance to sectors helping us reach net zero emissions. The second, Economic Security and Resilience stream, will identify industries vulnerable to supply disruptions that require support to unlock sufficient private investment. Andrew Forrest's Fortescue Energy is a major proponent of using renewable energy for onshore production of products like green ammonia and iron, though it has shelved its green hydrogen plans for now.
The government should really focus on infrastructure to make sure the cost of renewable energy is competitive globally. Making sure we have the value add infrastructure around that would be really helpful.
Investors know and believe that Australia has very specific comparative advantages in industries like green hydrogen, critical minerals, obviously the renewable energy, and seeing how these can be supported through this legislation is really important.
One question is whether the net zero transformation stream is just about supporting new technologies. Established manufacturing companies like Mondelez, which owns Cadbury, among other food brands, has been transitioning to renewable power, but it isn't there yet. The company has a power purchasing agreement to operate all its Victorian plants on wind-generated energy, and hydroelectricity powers 90% of the needs of its largest Tasmanian plant. But that doesn't help in areas that use gas.
So that's going to involve considerable investment to electrify. And we want to make sure two things. One is that the electricity that we need to source will then be reliable and also cost effective. We're very keen to do that, but it is going to be costly. It's going to be difficult to make them stack up in the absence of some form of incentives.
Whether food manufacturing fits into the description of industries where Australia has a unique advantage or needs to ensure it is not vulnerable to supply chain issues is a classic example of the questions that have to be clarified in this new industry policy area. Submissions to the Senate inquiry have come from industries as diverse as caravan makers and software developers, as well as the food and grocery industry.
There are clearly some areas of strategic advantage where Australia has comparative advantage. So, for example, we have significant shares of the world's known resources in certain key mineral areas: iron, steel, cobalt, all those sorts of things. Those that will be important in a low emission future. Secondly, processing those materials with our renewable energy is an area where we also have potentially a comparative advantage.
Helping the transition may be as simple as tweaking existing tax rules.
Policies around future made in Australia, or in fact what I'd like to call how do we keep it made in Australia, don't always involve this concept of governments handing out money, but assistance to do it, such as instant asset write-off or accelerated depreciation, will make those business cases stack up and potentially accelerate them.
Casting a pall over the credibility of the new policy structure is the decision of the government to include two specific projects which have not been subjected to the National Interest Framework. The first is the joint federal Queensland decision to invest nearly $1 billion in a US-based quantum startup, PsiQuantum, with the aim of building one of the first commercial-scale quantum computers in the world. The second is another $1 billion investment in just one solar panel manufacturing project. The federal opposition says they are captain's picks, which make a mockery of the National Interest Framework.
This so-called National Interest Framework that investments will be measured against was not used when it came to the decision to allocate nearly $1 billion of taxpayers' money to an American company, PsiQuantum. That framework was not used when it came to the decision to commit $1 billion to manufacturing of rooftop solar panels, a sector where all the experts say there's no way Australia can be cost competitive with China.
A government spokesperson told 7:30 the opposition's comments were illogical and ill-informed, since the National Interest Framework did not exist when these investment decisions were made. He said the investment processes applied to the PsiQuantum deal involved rigorous whole-of-government due diligence, and these practices were then adapted to form the basis of the Future Made in Australia legislation. The National Audit Office has flagged it may probe government investment vehicles, including the PsiQuantum deal, in the future.